for another engaging session as part of the International Teaching Month at Institute of Law, Nirma University. As you know, it's the session is on the topic of human trafficking, and we have a very esteemed and experienced panel, to say the least. Uh, but before I do the introductions, I would like to invite our Dean and Director, Professor Purvi Pokhriyal, to please welcome the speakers. And yeah, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Kushal. As such, we don't have much time. So I formally welcome Dr. Davor and Mr. Amod Kanth. Thank you for joining us today. And this session is very, very special. Human trafficking is an area we have been discussing and how to overcome these issues. We have a great two scholars, who have worked in this area, and we are really eagerly looking forward to listen to you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would briefly like to introduce our speakers before we begin. We have with us Professor Davor Derencinovic. I hope I pronounced the name properly, sir. Sir is a full professor of criminal law and criminology at Zagreb Faculty of Law, University of Croatia. He has also been, he's also president of Croatian Academy of Legal Sciences and was a president of the Croatian Association for Criminal Law and Practice. And he's also ad hoc judge on European Court of Human Rights and was a president and member of the Council of European Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings. Well, this is just part of his very expansive set of achievements. So before I invite you, sir, I would also like to introduce our second speaker for the day, which is Sir Amod Kanth. As you may know by now, he is a retired police officer. He was also a member coordinator with NITI Ayog CSO Standing Committee and a chairman of Domestic Workers Sector Skill Council. And he is now and has been actively involved with an organization called the Prayas Institute of Juvenile Justice, which is working to create educational and economic empowerment for the youth and women and the deprived sections of the society. So I welcome both of you, and I would now like to invite Professor Davor to deliver his talk. Professor Davor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nandwani. Thank you very much to all of you. First of all, I am really grateful to the distinguished Dean, Dr. Purvi Pokhriyal, and also to my good friend and colleague from the Penn State University, Dr. Steve Barnes, for putting us in contact. This is really the first time for me to participate in an event like this in India. And I really do believe that this is not the last time. And I'm really looking forward to further our cooperation. And I would like here in Croatia to open the door, so to say, to colleagues, to scholars and students from India. The topic I'm going to talk about is the global one, because there is no single country in the world that is free from the modern day slavery, as the human trafficking is often labeled, because it really is a slavery in a way. Although the methods that the traffickers use today are more subtle than a slavery. Slavery is, ownership over the person, complete control over the movement of the person, and so on and so forth. In human trafficking or trafficking in human beings, the methods used by the traffickers are more subtle, and for that reason, they're much more difficult to be detected and the perpetrators to be apprehended, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. But before I get started with the topic, I would like to say a few words about where do I come from, to put everything in a context and for you to better understand actually my position and my involvement into the topic. Very preliminary, I will try to address the topic not only as the academic, not only as a professor of criminal law and criminology, because I teach the subject at the university. Because as Dr. Nandwani said, I worked for 8 years in 2 mandates, in 2 terms for GRETA. GRETA is the acronym It's still not as popular as Greta Garbo or Greta Thunberg. If you Google it, there is not really likely that you will find us, but we are becoming more and more popular worldwide. And Greta is the acronym for Group of Experts Against Trafficking in Human Beings. It's the monitoring expert group that evaluates the implementation of the European Convention against trafficking in human beings by the member states, 47 of them. And it's one of its kind in the world, because on a global level, on the UN level, there is no similar body entrusted with the implementation of the anti-trafficking Palermo Protocol. So I will speak also from my experience from the field, because we were visiting countries and we witnessed human rights violations, but we also tried to advise countries on how to improve their systems and to prevent people from being subjected to the trafficking in human beings. Well, just a word about my country. So you see this small red dot right bottom to the screen. It's Croatia. Well, for some, it is a Southeast European country. For some, it is the East European country. And for some, it's the Middle European country. So decide for yourself. But what is for sure is that Croatians, where they came actually to Europe, and it was 7th century AD, it's not really sure whether they came from Carpathian region, what is today Russia, or from Persia, because the friend of mine, who is a known, worldwide known geneticist, told me that he found some common genotype in between the people in Persia, what is today Iran, and Croatia. But regardless of our origins, one thing is for sure, that we took maybe the best region, the best territory, so to say, back in 7th century AD, because we have, well, all in one package, so to say. So we have the beautiful coastline, more than 1,000 islands. You can see the city of Dubrovnik, the fortified city here, medieval republic. What is interesting in the context of today's topic is that the Dubrovnik was the first medieval republic back at a time that abolished slave trade. So the first medieval republic, before Venice, before Firenze, before all this Italian communes and cities in the Middle Ages. And it is also known as a pearl of Adriatic. And what might be also interesting for you is that we organize courses on postgraduate and graduate level in Dubrovnik, because there is inter-university center. Idea of a great man of the time in the 70s of the last century, Mr. Ivan Supek, Dr. Ivan Supek, who was also president of the Croatian Academy of the Arts and Sciences, was to put together people from the East and the West. You have to understand that it was a time of the Cold War era. And his idea was to put actually the scholars from the worldwide together to discuss the topics of the global interest. And today we have a course on crime prevention and the international security. And so far, in 15 editions so far, we gathered more than 300 students from the worldwide, and also the academics, practitioners, and all the others who were teaching at a course. So there is a possibility for NIRMA university students to attend these courses as well. To the left is St. Mark's Church. It's the capital, Zagreb. That's the place where I live. The Zagreb is really the heart of the Croatia in terms of the 1 million inhabitants. Croatia is a tiny, comparing to India in terms of the size, and in terms of the population, it's about 4.5 million. And 1/4 of the population live in Zagreb. That's a St. Mark's Church, and the building of the parliament, and the building of the Croatian government. You can see Plitvice Lakes, bottom left of the screen, one of the natural wonders of Croatia, and some of the beaches. You can find the spot for yourself if you decide ever to come to Croatia, because we really have a lot of beautiful places where you can enjoy beautiful and genuine nature. And just a word about my university. This is University of Zagreb, the oldest higher education institution in Croatia. It was established back in 1776, and there were 3 faculties at the time that established Zagreb University. Faculty of Law, meaning us, Faculty of Theology, and Faculty of Philosophy. Today, the university is the biggest university in Croatia and in the region, and we have a lot of possibilities in terms of the exchange with the students and the professors worldwide. And we have the cooperation, the agreement on collaboration with Penn State and with some other very distinguished and excellent American universities. But we don't have any agreement with Indian universities so far, and I really do hope that in the near future we'll be able to conclude the one. So as to the topic, what is trafficking in human beings? You can see here a road, a highway. Well, I decided to pick some slides. I don't know if you like it or not. But the topic is very gray, even black. You know, it could really turn you down. So that's why I decided to use these vivid colors just in order to make your mood a little bit better about the topic. But I also tried to make some ideas on the topic and on the phenomena. And the trafficking, well, is really about the movement. When you traffic drugs, you move the drugs, for instance, from one place to another. When you traffic firearms, you also do that. You traffic it from one place to another. When you traffic human beings, and keep in mind that the human being is unfortunately the only commodity that could be sold unlimited number of times. And that's why this activity of the organized criminal groups is so developed, because it's very lucrative. They can really get a lot of money from the human trafficking. Is that the human being is really commodity that can be sold unlimited number of times. That's why the prevention is very important in this regard. The human factor and also the understanding, knowledge, and the sensitivity. I'll put the emphasis on the sensitivity of all the actors involved. And this is dynamic phenomenon. You can see actually here the road. There is a movie, I don't know if you've seen it, La Strada, the popular movie directed by Federico Fellini, famous Italian movie director, about a young woman who was sold by her mother, because they were very poor, to a traveling circus, to a man who was played by Anthony Quinn, the famous the Hollywood actor at the time. And according to some the commentators, La Strada is one of the most influential movies of 20th century. It's a very touching story about what is good and what is bad in a people, what are the motives that drive the people actually in their actions. And this movie was used as some sort of inspiration for the group of women who back in 70s established La Strada International, the very strong platform or network of the NGOs protecting most fundamental human rights, especially rights of the women who were trafficked for the purpose of the sexual exploitation. And this is particularly the reason I used, the road, in order to better explain the substance or the very essence of this phenomenon of human trafficking. I said is the movement of a persons, but it's not just the mere movement of a persons for the profit. It has to be distinguished from the smuggling of migrants, because in smuggling of migrants, you also move people from one place to the another, and the smugglers, they get profits for that. But there are three distinctive elements that distinguish trafficking in human beings from the human smuggling. And these three elements are actions, means, and the purpose. Purpose is always exploitation, which is not the case with the human smuggling. And what is very important to keep in mind is that this phenomenon is very, very dynamic. So we cannot take, what we know about a phenomenon for granted. I will give you an example. In the context of transnational trafficking, there are three categories of the countries: country of origin, country of transit, so there's the country through which, or the countries, maybe more countries, more than just the one, through which the victims actually transit to the final country, to the country of the final destination, and that's the place where the exploitation normally takes place. But this can change over time. For instance, my country, Croatia, was back in 90s predominantly country of transit for those victims from Eastern Europe who were trafficked to the Northern Europe and Western Europe. And these are normally the routes of trafficking. They all go in principle from east to west and from south to north. But today, situation has been changed because Croatia is more and more turning to the country of origin of the victims, but also to a country of destination, because Croatia joined the EU back in 2013. And as such, it became more and more attractive, more popular for the traffickers to send the victims to Croatia and to exploit the victims in the country. So it tells us a lot about the nature of the phenomenon, about the internal dynamics, and it tells us about the importance of all those who are involved, and you will see who should be involved in a good and sound anti-trafficking strategy, to get prepared and to adjust their activities to actually to prevent trafficking in human beings, to prosecute perpetrators, and to convict them for the crimes they committed. So the first element is element of the actions. You can see here in all relevant international treaties, from the Palermo Protocol of the United Nations to the Council of Europe Convention, ASEAN Convention, EU Directive Against Human Trafficking, the actions are the same. So harboring, receipt of persons, recruitment, transport, transfer. Recruitment, for instance, is initial stage. So the traffickers recruit the victims, and they use various methods for that. And these methods we call means. This is the second element. This is really the criminal element of human trafficking. It could be either threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of position of vulnerability, and giving payments or benefits of those who are in control of the person who has been trafficked. For instance, deception. This is the most common method, I would say, today, because, as I said, traffickers more and more turn to the more subtle methods of recruiting the victims. They simply deceive them. For instance, the young and naive woman in Romania, for instance, or in Moldova or Bulgaria is deceived that she will work in Germany, for instance, in a dance club, or at some other place, that she will be well paid, and so on and so on, and that this is the opportunity for her and for her family as well. And she decides to go there in a very naive manner, not expecting what will happen at the place of the destination, in the country of destination. When she arrives to the country of destination, what's normally the procedure? Her papers, the travel documents and the other identity documents, are taken from her. She's kept locked. She has to provide mostly the sexual services to the clients, unlimited number of times. She's deprived of her liberty. She is afraid to go to the police because she doesn't believe, she doesn't trust the police. She doesn't trust in uniform because the country she's coming from is known for the corruption among the police and other law enforcement. And it is really, really difficult for the victim to come forward and to say, to the police, well, I am a victim of a human trafficking. So that's the vicious circle, in a way, that makes it very difficult for the victims of a human trafficking to come forward and to report their case to the police. What we have in Europe now is the trend of the trafficking of the victims from Nigeria. And the victims, mostly women, young women from Nigeria, who are, by the way, recruited by other women. This is interesting indicator when you have women who recruit other women, that it has to do with human trafficking, because these recruiters are former victims of human trafficking, but they're also now the part of the trafficking ring. They use coercion, but they also use some, we would say, religious or black magic, better to say, than religious practices of voodoo. They use juju practices. It's the ritual performed by the local priest, who would put a spell on a person if he or she decides to go to the police and to report the case. And spells like, well, you will have, well, no children in the future, something terrible will happen to you or to your family, and so on and so forth. So in addition to the coercion, threat to the family, if you report to the police in a country of destination, something terrible will happen to your family, there is also this belief, you know, of the victim who was subjected to voodoo, that the gods will turn against her or against her family. So they're very, very subtle methods sometimes, and it's really very, very difficult to get actually the victims to testify, to come forward and to tell the law enforcement that they're victims of a human trafficking. And by the way, some of them are really not aware that they are victims of a human trafficking, especially those who are in transit. They still do not know. So it's very difficult for the country of transit to detect the case while the person himself or herself is not aware that he might be the victim of a human trafficking. And they're, you know, in a fear. They believe that they're themselves responsible for what happened. And despite of very bad conditions these people live and work on, for them it's still better, for most of them, than in the country of the origin, and especially goes for the labor exploitation. And this is also one of the elements that makes the detection of these cases and the apprehension of the perpetrators very, very difficult. Abuse position of vulnerability. This is one of the subtle methods. So you know that a person is in a position of vulnerability and dependency on the other person for economic reasons, health reasons. It might be, well, the person with the disabilities. I came across many cases where the people with the mental disabilities and the physical disabilities are trafficked for instance, for the forced begging on the streets of the European capitals and the other cities. So these people are really very, very dependent. They're the whole national minorities in Europe, Roma, for instance, who are disproportionately affected with the phenomenon of a human trafficking. So let's move on with the exploitation. You can see here the various purposes. It could be sexual exploitation. There is a misperception about the human trafficking. Well, the most people who are not really familiar with the subject, if you ask them what is trafficking, they would say, well, the trafficking is a transnational movement, well, across the borders of the people for the purpose of the prostitution or the sexual exploitation. Well, it is true that most of the victims, according to the statistics, are women and girls who are trafficked transnationally for the purpose of sexual exploitation. But we are witnessing also the increase in numbers of those who are trafficked internally within the country for the purposes other than sexual exploitation. For instance, labor exploitation, the removal of organs, similar practices to servitude, for instance. There is really a huge problem of servitude. So who are those people who are exploited in servitude? Those are people who work, you know, in houses or in the premises of other people who are paid by them, but they're obviously underpaid, and they're kept in a, well, prison-like conditions. And what we know from the field is that it is really a problem in the diplomatic households worldwide, especially in the countries where there's big diplomatic community. For instance, in New York, in Austria, and in other countries where the UN has its headquarters. There are a lot of people who are underpaid, who work for such a small amount of money under very, very difficult circumstances. They live in a very bad accommodation, and they're victims of human trafficking in a way. But this is very difficult for them because, you know, the principle of extraterritoriality, and the labor inspectors, for instance, the police, they don't have really the access to those places. I came across in some countries the exploitation of the women for the surrogate motherhood, for instance. Those young girls and women who live in poverty, they're paid by the rich couples that can have really their own children to give the birth. Well, one would argue, well, but this is their free will. I think that this concept of free will, there is basically in the definition of the trafficking that the consent of the person would not be considered as a sufficient if the means, the criminal means, so the deception, force, threat, abduction, and so on, were used. So the consent has very, very relative weight in assessing whether something is trafficking or is not. And there are other, of course, types of exploitation. For instance, I was the rapporteur of Greta in United Kingdom, and they traffic children in the context of the so-called county lines. This is basically drug dealing. So they will just get the cell phone, and when they receive the call, they will get instructions on where to transfer the drugs, and they will get paid for that, but of course underpaid. And because of their vulnerable position, because they're still children, and when it comes to the children, this element of criminal means is not required. So the trafficking for children would exist even if no criminal means were used. So just element number 1 and 3, actions and exploitation, would suffice in these cases. All right, so let's move on. There are 4 priorities in fight against human trafficking, and as we call them, 4 Ps. It's prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. When I joined Greta, it was back in 2009, I thought that trafficking in human beings is all about the criminal law. It's all about organized crime, you know, prosecuting traffickers and penalization of these practices. But then I learned it's not just about criminal law. It's about various branches of law, from the civil law to the administrative law, because it's about residence permits for the victims. It's about recovery and the reflection period for the victims. All of those countries who are members of the Council of Europe Convention are obliged to give the recovery and reflection period in a duration of at least 30 days for those people who might be the victims of human trafficking. That's the time for the victim to decide, well, first of all, to recover for the trauma experienced through the trafficking, and then to decide whether to cooperate or not with the law enforcement. If you just overlook this, if you don't give the recovery and the reflection period to a person who might be a victim of human trafficking for various reasons, for instance, and that's what happens in many European countries. In cases of migrants, they're just immediately deported. And all, you know, despite of the fact that a person might be a victim of human trafficking, and this is the violation of the convention. So it is about the administrative law. It's about the civil law. It's the compensation for the damages they suffered for the fact that they were being victims of human trafficking. But it's also about you know, the psychology. It's about the psychiatry as well. It's about well, the prevention, the media campaigns, and so on and so forth. So a lot of various disciplines have importance in this anti-trafficking campaigns. So not only the legal one, but also the non-legal, political, diplomatic, social, sociological. For instance, empowerment of disadvantaged groups like Roma and other. Well, it depends on the country, but in Europe, it's mostly the Roma people. Measures to discourage demand, right? There are some countries in which prostitution is legal in Europe. So, and prostitution has some connections with human trafficking. And it's very important to conduct the campaigns, to make them publicly available in order to send the message, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And if you engage in that kind of the activity, please keep in mind that this person might be a victim of human trafficking, the person you pay for the sexual services, and so on. Then it's about the protection. to protect the persons, to give them, to grant them recovery and reflection, residence and working permits, and to provide for the non-punishment. This is very important principle that defines that the victims of human trafficking should not be prosecuted nor punished for this status-related crime. For instance, in some countries prostitution is legal, in some countries prostitution is illegal, either as the misdemeanor or the criminal offense. But it is important, if the person is trafficked, that the person himself or herself is not prosecuted for the misdemeanor or the crime of the prostitution. The same goes for the illegal entry to the country, or overstaying in the country, or illegal employment, working without the papers, and so on and so forth. Because why? This is just the consequence of the person being trafficked. And if you punish the person, and if you don't punish the perpetrator, this is just the highway, and you will lose the victim as a potential witness in a case against trafficker, and you will violate the most fundamental human rights of the victim of the human trafficking, not to be punished for the status-related crime. Then it's about the prosecution, effective sanctions, penalizing legal entities who, in many cases, actually are behind the scene of the human trafficking. Mutual legal assistance is very important because, as I said, in most of the cases, this is transnational crime. And it is also very, very important to protect victims and witnesses from intimidation. What is also very important, partnerships, building partnerships with the NGOs and with the other countries, because we cannot actually tackle this transnational problem of human trafficking just relying on ourselves and on domestic law enforcement and the domestic judiciary and other bodies. We have to cooperate with each other. I will give you an example. In these times of COVID, the modus operandi of the traffickers and some of the ways they operate changed, and there is a huge increase of some other types of exploitation. For instance, sexual abuse of children through the live streaming. And what do we know? Well, most of these cases take place, somewhere in Asia, for instance, in Philippines and in some other countries. But it's live streamed mostly for those clients in Europe and in North America and so on. So there are a lot of questions, and issues concerning the mutual legal assistance and cooperation with the law enforcement with the countries. It might be the fact that there is no, the treaty or the bilateral agreement, with the countries where the live streaming takes place. There might be some human rights considerations and so on and so forth. So this is very difficult, and that's why it's very, very important to build these strategic partnerships, first with the NGOs and then with the international counterparts. Speaking about legally binding international law, let's keep this because there are 3 conventions, 1 directive, and a lot of so-called soft law resolutions, recommendations. What is the most important is the global document, UN protocol, that is protocol to the Transnational Organized Crime Convention of the United Nations from 2000. On European soil, there are 2 documents that are very important: Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings and the EU Directive. I will tell you a bit more about the Council of Europe Convention because it's really relevant for us. And the GRETA, this monitoring body, was established under this convention. So this is the first comprehensive human rights treaty against THB. Why I'm saying first comprehensive? Because Palermo Protocol was the instrument of criminal law. So the Palermo Protocol deals mostly with the criminal law measures and not really with the human rights protection of the victims of human trafficking. In addition, Palermo Protocol is only about the transnational trafficking, while the Council of Europe Convention is about trafficking, being it domestic or transnational in nature. And there are certain mechanisms in this convention that are very, very specific and that cannot be found in any other instrument worldwide. So it was adopted back in 2005, in force from 2008. It's been ratified by 47 states. There are 47 states who are members of the Council of Europe. But these 47 states that ratify are not all the states of the Council of Europe. because the Russian Federation didn't ratify yet. Hopefully they will do it in the future. But the Belarus ratified the convention, and Belarus, well, is a European country, but they're not members of the Council of Europe. What is very important for this convention, like for some other conventions of Council of Europe, is that it's open for the accession even for the non-European countries and non-Council of Europe countries. So this is a possibility for India, for instance. So any country can, now we are negotiating, I mean, the Council of Europe with some Maghreb countries, with Algeria, with Morocco, with Israel as well. And there is a possibility just for any state to submit their request to access to the convention. And if all the parties actually agrees to that, then the party can accede to the convention. And this could help significantly countries in building actually their whole system, this holistic approach against the trafficking in human beings. It has human rights dimension. So it's not only, as I said, about the responsibility of the individual perpetrators, it's about the responsibility of the state. Because if the state fails to provide protection to the victim, for instance, or if the state fails to identify the person who is a victim of a human trafficking, adds the violation of the positive obligation under the Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And there were some cases, I will mention these cases a little bit later on. I don't have much time, so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. It's a global coverage, as I said. It covers transnational and domestic. It's serious criminal offense, irrespective of involvement of organized crime. Identification is very, very important. The states have an obligation to establish national referral mechanism. In short, what is NRM? Well, it's a system. So who does what? You need to have some sort of national referral mechanism to know actually what are the standard operating procedures once the person comes across of the potential victims of a human trafficking. What, for instance, an NGO activist can do when he or she comes across the potential victims of human trafficking, to whom to report, how to cooperate. In some countries, there are mobile teams. For instance, in Croatia, we have mobile teams. They are composed of the police, of the NGO activists, of the social services in cases of children, and so on. So some countries have some different solutions, but it is very, very important to have this system. Otherwise, you are blind. You don't know actually how the procedure should look like. Then partnerships, as I already mentioned, and monitoring. It's really an added value of the convention, because there is this twofold or double track system of the evaluation and monitoring. There is Greta, there's the expert level, 15 people from the various countries and various backgrounds, and the committee of the parties, that's the political body. The ambassadors in Strasbourg actually sit in the committee of the parties, and they, in most cases, just confirm our findings, and they issue recommendations to the state parties. So as you can see here on the photo, this is Greta, or better to say, it was Greta. It was the first composition. And the people from various countries, from Norway, Croatia, Moldova, France, Albania, Armenia, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Slovak Republic, Portugal, Denmark, Romania, and Malta. You can see just 13 people, not 15, because at a time, when the first composition of Greta, the historical composition of Greta was composed, there were just 13 members to the convention, and all these 13 members nominated their experts. I had a luck actually to went through the nomination procedure, and I became the member of the first composition, and in the meantime I was elected as a vice president, and for the last 2 years as a president. My terms expired just the end of the last year, and I cannot be re-elected because there is the limit of the 2 terms. You can see here, well, the photo from our plenary, where we discuss reports. You can see here also the photo from our plenary. We basically, this was a meeting with the Cybercrime Convention Expert Committee, because we exchange quite regularly with other bodies within the Council of Europe, but also outside the Council of Europe, on their experiences with a money laundering, for instance, Moneyval Committee, Greco Committee, it's on corruption, because these are all, you know, the committees that have some intersections with Greta. Corruption, for instance, it's very relevant, because you can train your immigration officer you can tell them beautiful stories on how to prevent human trafficking, but if the person is corrupted, it won't work. If the person, receives money from the traffickers, you have to really eradicate corruption in order to fight against human trafficking. In a way, fight against human trafficking is a fight against all the dysfunctional moments we have in our societies. When we manage to get rid of corruption, I'm sure, or to reduce corruption, it's impossible to get rid completely of the corruption. But once we manage to reduce the corruption, I'm sure that we will, to a certain extent, reduce the human trafficking in our societies as well. And you can see here, when we are visiting countries, we are, not just analyzing, we are not just checking the papers, their national strategies, legislation. We also go directly, on site to the places where some people who might be the victims of human trafficking are accommodated. We normally visit shelters, safe houses, but we also go to places like prisons. We also go to places, you can see here the photo from Medvedov. There's the immigration centers for the illegal immigrants in Slovak Republic. There was group 2 of us, plus the person from the secretariat and the interpreter, where we actually talk to the authorities, but also to the people who are kept there, because they are quite vulnerable to human trafficking. I will just skip this because this is the procedure. How does it go? First, we prepare the questionnaire. Our evaluation is divided in cycles. Each cycle lasts 4 years, and all the countries have to be included in a given cycle. Now we are in the middle of the 3rd cycle, and the topic, the thematic focus of the 3rd evaluation round is access to justice by the victims of human trafficking. So first, we draft the questionnaire, we send the questionnaire to the country. There is a deadline for them to respond. Once we receive it, we plan the visit to the country. Unfortunately, due to the COVID, we can't really visit countries now. So we conducted a few online evaluations, and there is a plan for 2021. We'll see how will the situation evolve and whether we'll be able to go directly on the spot, because you can't see, again, everything just from the paper and from the online meetings. Then we discuss report first. We send it back to the government for their comments. And then we, again, at a plenary of Greta, discuss about the report, including the comments we received from the government. And then we adopt the report. We send it to the Committee of the Parties, and the Committee of the Parties issue recommendations to the country. And there is a cycle of 1 year for the country to report what's been done and what still remains to be done in the context of the fight against human trafficking. I will just try to be very brief here about the cases. Landmark cases of the European Court on Human Rights. There's Article 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Prohibition of slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labor. But there are some exceptions to it. For instance, those who work in the detention centers, it wouldn't be considered as the forced labor, or those who work, normally in cases of emergency and things like that. And there were a few cases. I will just mention a few of them that I consider as the most relevant. Siliadin versus France. There was a young Togolese woman who were kept as as a slave in a servitude-like condition in a French family. She turned to the authorities, but in France there was no criminal offense of servitude at the time, and the court found that the French legislation was not in accordance with the convention, and that France violated the European Convention, but by not penalizing the servitude. Another case, really landmark case, was Rance versus Cyprus in Russia, and it concerned. This was a tragic case with a tragic end, I would say, because the young woman from Russia, Oksana Rantseva, she entered Cyprus on the basis of the artist visa. But it was just the cover-up for the prostitution. She went there to dance in a nightclub, but in fact she worked there as a prostitute. She didn't know that. When she went there, she was of course abused. She went to the police, and she wanted to report the case. But what the police did, instead of giving her protection, recovery, reflection, and so on, they called her boss. And the next morning she was found dead, very, very close to the place she lived. And her father, Mr. Rantsev, initiated the case before the ACHR, and the ACHR found the violations of Article 4. And this is the first time that a court explicitly said that despite the fact that the trafficking is not explicitly mentioned in Article 4, it should be considered as a slavery and modern day slavery, and there are positive obligations of the states to prevent it and to have an effective investigation of the case if there is a suspicion on a human trafficking. There was one case that concerns my country, Croatia. There was a case on a forced prostitution. There was a retired police officer who abused, actually, who was a pimp to a woman who had to prostitute herself. He was acquitted on all charges. She was the only witness in the case. And according to the court, her testimony was not reliable because she changed her statement a couple of times and so on and so forth. The court found that it is quite normal for the victim to change the story from time to time because they're under the trauma. The psychologist was not actually present in a courtroom at the time. And there were some other witnesses who were, who knew the facts of the case, but who were not examined by the prosecutor. And the court found that it was the first time that the Grand Chamber of the court found the violation, that the authorities failed to undertake the effective investigation of the case of the human trafficking, and that the people involved, mostly those from judiciary and a prosecution, were not sensitized about the position of the victim of human trafficking, their human rights, needs, their vulnerable position, and so on and so forth. And then there was a case of Chaudhary and others versus Greece. It's also very interesting because it considers the labor exploitation. There were people from Bangladesh who worked in Manolada in Greece on a farm. They were picking strawberries there in the presence of the armed guards. They were allowed to leave the place from time to time. They were not in chains, but the court found in this case that even if the person has a freedom to move from one place to another and to leave the site of the exploitation, it still has to be considered as the human trafficking if there is no acceptable or a realistic alternative to submitting to a human trafficking. So that's this abuse of the position of the vulnerability, because otherwise, if they left the place, they would be considered as illegal immigrants and they would be immediately deported back to Bangladesh, where they could be re-trafficked, their families could have problems, and so on and so forth. So I'm now just very close to an end of my presentation. There are some contributions, challenges. What's the impact of the work of Greta and the Council of Europe? From some small steps, I remember I was in one country, the rapporteur, and I noticed that in a shelter, the places where the victims were accommodated, there were bars on the window. I asked, well, the persons who run the shelter, what's the reason for that? Why do we have bars? I said, well, it's for the protection of the victims. But I said, but this is not good for them because they're kept in prison-like conditions while they're victims of a human trafficking. So for them, this is just the prolongation of their trauma. You have to remove the bars. And basically they removed the bars the other day. So that was really good. The feeling that you can really have an impact and provoke some positive changes. But in the long term, many countries improve their legislative and institutional framework. They strengthen partnership with the NGOs and with the others. It's still, though, insufficient awareness of some forms of the THB. For instance, trafficking for the labor exploitation, as I said, diplomatic households, child trafficking. I didn't have a time to speak about it, but I'm sure that Mr. Caldwell will address this issue. Migrants and THB, many countries in Europe actually approach to the issue of trafficking from the illegal migration perspective, not really from the human rights perspective of the victims, potential victims of human trafficking. And there is, of course, impact of COVID on everybody, including to the victims of trafficking, because shelters are closed, the law enforcement activities are diverted to something else, not the trafficking, and so on and so forth. And at the end, just let me to give my final thought with you. well, trafficking is all about us, about human beings. And as I said, human being is the only commodity that can be sold a limited number of times. So that's why it's very lucrative. And that's why we need really a human rights approach in this. Because, you know, trafficking of drugs, you can have official dogs on airports. They can snap the drugs. Official dogs are not really helpful in detection of human trafficking. Scanners are not really helpful. What is really helpful? The people who are well-trained, who are not corrupted, and who are really willing to do their job, who know how to do that, in order to prevent actually that the people are subjected to the worst form of the abuse and the exploitation. And keep in mind what is always behind the scene. It's a human being who are definitely not for sale. And it was all in very gray and black, you know, colors. So I wanted to share with you something, I would say, which is in more optimistic color. As I said, we have about 1,000 islands in Croatia. This is one of them. You can see in the shape of a heart. And given the fact that the 14th of February was St. Valentine's Day, that is very popular in the countries with a Christian tradition, because he was the saint patron of love. I'm sending you a big heart from Croatia. And of course, I'm open for any comment or suggestion. Looking forward to the discussion. And I apologize for being a bit longer than it was originally planned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk. Now, very quickly, I would like to request Amod sir to please address us. I know it's he has another commitment to make. So over to you, Amod sir.
No, I'm very sorry to be really intervening in this entire lovely process. Professor Davor, I could have kept on hearing you endlessly. I mean, it was so informative, so interesting, and decidedly very close to what we are thinking, what we are doing. See, in fact, you actually referred to police a couple of times. To hear, I mean, ex-policeman hearing somebody in the role of a pimp or in the role of a policeman who's mixed up with the whole process is not a very pleasant thing to be. But then it's a fact. I mean, see, the trafficking in the Indian context, very briefly, I would like to say something. Because I'll be begging excuse of you. There is a program on under trial prisoners, and that's the program I have to appear on the national television. And so I have postponed that program for 15 minutes, but I'll have to go there. So very briefly, I would like to talk about what's happening here. See, first of all, the human trafficking, the very term human trafficking in the Indian laws, in the Indian constitution, that is 1950, when India became independent, and we got our own constitution of India as a non-colonial country. Then there was an expression called trafficking. I mean, it was prohibited. It was prohibited within the original constitution of India. But unfortunately, this term trafficking was not defined in the legal parlance. It was not defined. And we had another law called Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, which was Immoral Traffic Prohibition Act and Prevention Act. And that was all about commercial sex and prostitution. We don't prefer to use this term prostitution. It's a dirty word. And in the social sector parlance, we don't feel comfortable using this term prostitution. So the commercial sex was the main law. And that was the law which has been in operation all through all these years. Until 2013, that is nearly 63 years after the promulgation of India's constitution, we were able to create a definition, a real complete definition of the trafficking, the definition you talked about. What you described the trafficking in terms of the UN protocol, in terms of the international commitments, that kind of trafficking where, you know, this recruitment, transfer, harboring, receiving, all these things are prohibited when they are carried out involving abduction or fraud or deception or inducement, consent or without consent. I mean, these are the different types of situations which the UN protocol provided, but the Indian law did not have these things brought into the definition of trafficking. So the trafficking became a law in a way in 2013, after there was a notorious case where the conscience of entire nation was very badly disturbed. there was a gang rape of a particular girl, a medico girl. And that led to some extraordinary changes in the Indian penal code, the Indian laws. And that opportunity was taken by us. I also presented the case for some kind of change in the law, and trafficking was defined. So now when you define the trafficking in the Indian context, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act or the commercial sex, there, as you know, that any person who becomes a commodity, or any person, if that person happens to be the victim also, the girl or the woman who is selling her body for any kind of commercial gains, so that becomes a crime. A person who happens to be a pimp, who happens to be a procurer, who happens to be a brothel keeper, who happens to be anybody who is assisting and who is participating in the process of the sale and purchase of human body for commercial sex. I mean, broadly speaking, this is the kind of definition I am talking about. So that was the kind of law. And in that kind of law, very unfortunately, again, I would say that not that the Indian police was anywhere kind of away from what you're talking about. These kind of problems arose numerous times, that the police was, there are a lot of criticism of the police being part and parcel of the system. And that was the wrong thing to happen. Now, the worst part of the situation was that under Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, the victim of the crime, or the woman who happened to be the commercial sex worker, she was doubly victimized. And majority of cases means about 70% of the crimes, they used to be where the woman who was selling her body or soliciting customers, as we call it, they became the persons who were arrested also, and who were apprehended and prosecuted. So there is a demand. We have been really making a demand for a long time that the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act should be changed completely. And actually, there was no need to have this law at all, because now commercial sex becomes part and parcel of the larger kind of trafficking situation. There, as you know, that besides commercial sex, the biggest problem in India today happens to be the forced labor or the child labor. I mean, this country, probably you would not know that we have nearly 35 million children who happen to be the children who are vulnerable. They are the children who are vulnerable to all types of exploitation. They may be child labor, working children. They can be homeless children. They may be the children who are destitute and they have no place to go. So, I mean, these are the kind of children who are victims of various types of situations. And under the basic law of India for the children, that is Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act 2000, different types of children have been defined. That these are the types of children who are the children in need of care and protection. And there is a complete mechanism to look after those children. And these are the children about whom their rights in terms of United Nations Convention also are being violated all the time. I mean, their right to protection, right to survival, right to development, right to participation, all those rights are being violated all the time. And so nearly, I mean, it's a very broad figure that we have in mind, that nearly 30 to 35 million children who happen to be in that kind of situation, where either they being trafficked for various reasons, or they are vulnerable and they are in that situation where trafficking takes place. So this is something which has become the most prominent form of trafficking now. And we have a law with regard to the child labor also. And recently that law has been slightly changed and amended also. This is called Child and Adolescent Prohibition Regulation Act 2016. Recently, this law has been extended. Earlier, the childhood in this law used to be up to 14 years of age. So certain kind of activities, the child labor, the whole idea of child labor was not completely prohibited, but it was prohibited to a certain extent up to 14 years of age. Now, adolescent has been added to it. That is 14 to 18 years of age. And of course, we as a country, in various laws, they accept the definition of childhood up to 18 years of age. So up to 18 years of age, I think all forms of child labor are completely prohibited up to 14 years of age. And certain kinds of hazardous child labor, some occupations and some processes, they are prohibited up to 18 years of age. And if something happens to those children are subjected or made to work as child labor, and they are moved from one place to other place. I mean, they are being trafficked in that sense. So they become the victims of child labor, and they become victims of trafficking also. So the trafficking in the forced labor or child labor and child labor as a crime, they go together. I mean, they are together being taken care of. So this is something which has become the most prominent form of human trafficking here. Then we have got forced marriages. as you know that a large number of Indian girls or the children are married off before the age of 18 years. The minimum age for marriage in India is 18 years for the girls and 21 years for the boys. But in large number of cases, on account of socio-economic compulsions and deprivations, many of these girls, many of these boys, they happen to be thrown into a situation where they are being transported, they are being bought and sold. And it takes the overt form of child labor. Actually, it ultimately results into a very dirty kind of commercial sex or maybe forced sex, that kind of situation. So child sex abuse, the child sex abuse or various types of child sex abuse, that gets totally interlinked with the human trafficking issue, the child trafficking issue, which is one of the most important kind of trafficking, forms of trafficking, which is prevalent here. You know, broadly speaking, we have domestic child labor who get trafficked. You know, in India, we have got nearly 20 million women, particularly 90% of women who are working in the households. And a large number of these women, about 30% of those women who happen to be younger than 18 years of age, they are traveling from one place to other place. They are kept in various households. They are being exploited and abused many a times. They are not being paid their proper wages. Logically speaking and legally speaking, these girls and these children below 18 years should not work, but it happens. They are taken from one state to other state. The affluent states, affluent cities like Bombay and Delhi and other cities, these girls, they are brought from the states like Jharkhand and Bihar and Odisha. And then while they are traveling, they are being brought here. Some syndicates are operating all the time. There are placement agencies or placement agents, you know, who are actually traffickers. And they have their own syndicate. They have their own systems to carry these children from one place to other place. And these children or women also many a times who are adults, when they work as domestic workers, they get subjected to child trafficking or domestic. They are adults, but they are getting trafficked. We have got agricultural labor in a very large number. You know, there are various forms of bonded labor in India. Although it is reducing by the passage of time, because the bonded labor laws and the activists and the police and other authorities have really tried their best to stop this kind of phenomena of bonded labor. But it's happening, and particularly in the agriculture sector and in the sector of construction work. You know, construction activities are going on. It can be road construction, it can be building construction. So large number of bonded labor who go as a group, and they are kept taken from one place, which is a poorer area of the country, to the richer area of the country, and they are kept there. Then we have got areas like carpet industry, then small scale industries, then fishing and shrimp. That kind of business is going on. So there are all types of situations which actually fall within the definition of trafficking now. The definition that we have now acquired in 2013, as I mentioned to you. Unfortunately, you know, this particular definition, that is definition of child labor within Indian Penal Code, Section 370, although it is defined very well, and there are different forms of trafficking, which I have explained just now, not many cases are being registered, not many cases are being prosecuted. In fact, 2019, we just had about 2,200 cases. In a country where millions of children, millions of women, millions of adults who are socio-economically deprived, they happen to be either vulnerable or being subjected to trafficking, just a couple of thousand cases, I think, is a very small number. Although cases are being registered, because as I mentioned to you that we have got various provisions under the Indian Penal Code where wrongful confinement, wrongful restraint and exploitations of various types are cognizable offenses, and the crimes can be registered in those cases, and the whole process is taken. They are prosecuted, they are convicted, all that happens, but they are not being accounted for as trafficking cases, because trafficking is now defined. I hope I am clear. The laws relating to child labor, the laws relating to juvenile justice, all these laws also have their own kind of numbers, a large number of cases, but those cases are from various directions, they are coming up. Now, some of the illegal activities which go along with the child labor, I think, which need to be mentioned, like begging. Begging, as you know, is a form of exploitation again. Again, among the beggars, nearly 30 to 40% beggars happen to be child labor. And begging can be a very, very dirty and very bad kind of exploitation again. And begging, of course, although it happens to be a social evil, But then in India, it is also a criminal offense, the begging kind of thing. And the begging connected to trafficking is a phenomena which I think is very important. You have also mentioned to organ trade, and organ trade, of course, is prevalent. And the government is very conscious about the organ trade, that organ trade is an issue which is deeply connected to trafficking. Then, of course, you refer to the drug peddling or smuggling, that kind of thing. So we also have that issue. I mean, globally speaking, as you know, that drug peddling or the drug trafficking is among the largest organized crimes, globally speaking. In India, it's the case. I mean, this country happens to be both the origin and transit and destination in respect of drug trafficking. It happens to be all three together in various parts of the country in respect of the human trafficking also. And of course, certain parts of the country which are said to be security zones, and there are serious problems of security in those parts of country. We have got something like child soldiers also, in the sense that there are children who get into, let's say, certain kind of insurgency, who get into violent activities, and they are subjected. And I would like to put them in that category of, again, worst forms of child labor. So these are some of the issues which are very important. And I mean, nationally speaking, trafficking is a very, very serious issue. And we have been trying for a separate law. Although the term trafficking, as I mentioned to you, was defined in 2013 through the Criminal Law Amendment Act and Indian Penal Code. But we are trying to have a separate law altogether. Because as you mentioned also, that trafficking is not only a crime, it is not only something connected to a legal offense, it is connected to the whole range of socio-economic circumstances. It is connected to the lives of people in a big way, connected to those vulnerable sections of society and those vulnerable groups of people who are subjected to trafficking. So there we are trying to have a law which is which creates a condition from end to end. We would like to take care of trafficking in 360 degrees. From the point where we are able to rescue a child or a victim of trafficking to the point that person is ultimately rehabilitated. I mean, under Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act 2000, we have that provision. But then that provision requires the multi-sectoral approach. You refer to the participation of NGOs also, for example. I mean, with us, let me inform you, as an organization, the organization I serve, we have got nearly 700 professionals who work for the organization. We have nearly 150 centers across 10 states of India. And then annually, we are able to take care of not less than 10 to 15,000 victims of child labor directly. We run 40 homes for them. We are running child helpline. You may not have heard about it, but perhaps the most prominent helpline in the country happens to be 1098. 1098 is a child helpline. And a large number of child labor cases, a large number of child trafficking cases are actually routed through the child helpline 1098. Then we have got child welfare committees, we have got district child protection unit, we have got a variety of schemes and programs within the various laws in the country which take care of child trafficking. So I think in a nutshell, I would like to mention that the problem of trafficking in India, child trafficking or any form of trafficking in India is not something which can be dealt with in a limited fashion. It is far, far beyond just being a crime. So there we have got whole range of partnership programs. The voluntary organizations are supposed to play a very important role. Most of the helplines, 1098 child helpline, are run by the voluntary organizations in about 600 districts of India. Now, as you know that we are a 1.3 billion population country, and we have got nearly 700 odd districts in the country. We have got nearly 17,000 police stations in the country. So, I mean, it's a vast, vast country, and our problems are endless. During the COVID times, you must have heard that nearly 122 million people lost their jobs. And maybe one doesn't know how many million, about 30 to 40 million children, they were traveling all over. So it's a country of huge dimensions. And since socio-economic deprivation happens to be a serious issue in the country, despite the fact that India is fourth largest economy, despite the fact that we are a very, very powerful country, not only in military terms, but economic terms also, we have these issues with us. So the phenomena of trafficking, I wished I could speak longer to you. I could explain more about it, but I have got another program to attend to. And well, I think maybe sometime in future, I'd like to participate in a program and talk more about it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amod, sir. I think both the addresses were kind of very enriching in how they tried to emphasize both on the universalities of the issue of human trafficking, and also at the at the same time talking about the particularities of different regions. The concerns that we might have in India are in some sense very different from the European concerns or the concerns in the West generally. So I think both the speakers, I think, thank you so much for such an enriching session, giving us insights into all those things. Now, there are a few questions, and Amod sir, if you have time, we would love for you to stay for the question answer session as well. And so,
now, if there's something specific from me, I can attend to one or two of them. Otherwise, if you permit me, I'd have to leave because they're waiting for me.
Yes,
on the national TV.
Yeah, there's one question that is specifically for you. It's by one of our students, Yashita Bhardwaj. She says that, sir, don't you think Immoral Trafficking of Prevention Act, rather than focusing on the main objective, that is prevention of trafficking, is more indulged in penalizing commercial sex in India? Rather than punishing the actual culprits of trafficking, this legislation is making the lives of victims more vulnerable. What is your point of view on this, and what's the solution to it?
As a policeman in past 34 years, and as someone working in the voluntary sector, I very strongly feel that this law is redundant. This law should have been done away with, major part of it. And now that we have got a separate legislation, not complete one, partial at least with regard to trafficking, we should cover the commercial sex within that kind of law. And decidedly, since majority of cases, as I mentioned here, the victim gets doubly victimized, a commercial sex worker, while soliciting or getting into the business, I think probably we have to give up that situation. It's a wrong situation. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. And also there is, in the same sense, there's talk of a Nordic model. Professor Davor, if you could shed some light on that, where the—
Can I take leave if you permit, Sir Professor Davor? I am very, very sorry. I am extremely sorry for leaving you and leaving all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amod Khan. It was very interesting to listen to your presentation. And it's always good, actually, to get some insight from the people who are working on the field. And it was really helpful and complementary to what I said. And I really do hope that we will have opportunity to collaborate and to have an exchange in the future on this and maybe some other issues as well.
Thank you. I would love to come and talk to you again. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So there was a question about the Nordic model, right? The Swedish model.
Yes. So if you could shed some light on that, because it essentially tries to punish the person who is seeking the sex rather than the people who are involved in the whole act of commercial sex, if you could say so. So if you could, it's been controversial. If you could shed some light on that. Yeah,
of course, it is a controversial issue. Of course, well, the governments of some of the Scandinavian countries, like Sweden actually, they were the first country that adopted this model. That is very different from the models from the other European countries, because in most of the countries, the prostitute himself or herself is the person who is penalized, who is prosecuted, either for the misdemeanor or the criminal offense of the prostitution. And of course, those who organize the prostitution, but not really the clients. While the Swedish model means that the client should be prosecuted and not really the prostitute. And there were claims of these Nordic governments, and they're trying to advertise, of course, their approach as the best approach. But there were some voices of criticism, of course, from the perspective of the Nordic country governments. This model actually contributes to the reduction of the human trafficking, while according to the others, this is not the case. And it was very interesting. And frankly speaking, I'm not in favor of any model per se. And Greta does not take the position on any model. For instance, there were countries in prostitution is legal, where the prostitution is illegal, the countries with the Swedish or the Nordic model, and so on and so forth. What it really matters for us is, okay, you have this kind of the model, but how does this correspond in reality, not in theory, with the discouraging demand for instance, for the sexual services. And what I know is that, and what do we know from the statistics and from the various studies that were conducted on this so-called Nordic model, that there is no positive correlation in between this kind of the model and reduction of the human trafficking. So obviously it's not enough just to, the copy and paste something from one country to another and to expect some good results for that. There are some other measures that have to be taken in order to reduce the human trafficking. And there was really a very interesting, very lively debate, even between the groups that were supposed to be on the same side. Feminist groups, for instance, they were those fractions in feminist groups who advocated very much, very strong in favor of the Swedish model, because their position was that the woman is treated as a subject in a prostitution, and the prostitution as such is not acceptable, right? And it should be banned, especially for those who pay for the sexual services. While the others had a different opinion, claiming that penalizing clients could really threaten the sex industry as a whole. And in the sex industry, every person, including women who are actually dealing with the prostitution, have a human right in this industry to express themselves in a way they want, and that's the free market. The issue of demand on the market and so on and so forth. It's still ongoing. It's difficult to give my final thought on this. But I think that it's not just up to the model, because there is no panacea, there is no magic wand. You cannot just introduce the model and say, "Wow, it's working now." You have to have some sort of so to say coordination in between the model you adopted and the concrete measures that are taken in order to reduce the human trafficking, because there is a concern in some countries. In my country, there were some considerations whether to introduce the Swedish model or not, and there were some voices, that this could turn the prostitution more underground, closer to the organized crime, which would be even more, harmful to the potential victims of the human trafficking. Though these are all, I would say, factors that have to be taken into account when we are actually talking about these issues and elaborating the models that are best for the realities of the society we live in. And I would just like to very briefly, before you tell me the other question, it's about the numbers. There is what Mr. Koch said. There is a huge discrepancy in between the estimations. We are talking about millions, even tens of millions of the victims around the globe, according to the NGOs, according to some surveys and the studies that were conducted. But what we as a Greta found in the statistics of the countries, this is a problem of the small numbers. In Germany, you have about 200, 300 for such a big country. In Croatia, you have 10 or 15 victims identified for a year. We know, we are sure that it should be more. But it's a problem of the statistics. I think on one side, maybe it's the inflation of the numbers by some FGOs, not all the NGOs, because there is International Labour Organization and their numbers are also very high. But there is a problem of the perception. I think the problem of the statistics and the problem of the non-reporting of the human trafficking in most of the countries. And see, obviously, it's pretty much similar in India too. So it has to be improved. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think it's interesting that you mentioned. I mean, you spoke also about the cinema and the debate between the feminists. So I think it's interesting because now we have this whole stream of movies and TV shows coming in, and the debate in between the feminists is whether it amounts to an act of free choice, women, women engaging in sexual acts, or I mean, for the lack of a better phrase, I just use that. And on the one side is that it amounts just to objectification and it furthers the patriarchal norms, and the other side is that it amounts to exercise of a free choice on part of the women who's so it's interesting. The other question, it's by one of our colleagues at the Institute, Surekha Talari. She asks, why is human trafficking on even in the modern times? Does it reflect a huge gap of inequality between genders in terms of livelihood options within nations? Or does it reflect any abnormality in sexual practices in the men across the world?
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting question. I think it has to do with inequalities. It has to do well, with the gender issues, of course. But again, the human trafficking is not only about the sexual exploitation. We have to keep in mind that there are other types of exploitation. They're, emerging, and we know that there's been an increase in numbers of other types of exploitation, especially the labor exploitation. But I agree. Yes, this is just the consequence, I think, of the inequalities, of the human rights violations, and so on and so forth. So the problem, actually, the colleague from India just mentioned, Mr. Amod, of the number of children, who live on the streets, 35 million. This is really the reason for the worry. And these children can quite easily be turned into victims of human trafficking. That's the problem. And we have to address really the root causes of the problem. Discrimination, poverty, inequalities, gender discrimination, discrimination towards certain groups of people, minorities, and so on and so forth. And when we accomplish to do that, I think that when we succeed, I think that we will be much more successful in the fight against human trafficking as well, because this is all very, very closely connected.
Well, thank you for that. Now, I don't think I'll be able to ask all the questions that have been put to me, but I will take one more question. It's by one of our students, Nishant Upadhyay. He says that, sir, thank you so much for an insightful session. We understand that there are socioeconomic differences between Croatia and India. I want to know what steps to curb corruption have been taken in Croatia, which actually worked and can be used in India as well.
Thank you very much for this question. Well, maybe I'm not the right person to be asked, because Croatia still struggles with corruption. And especially with the corruption in certain sectors. Within the economy, within the judiciary, for instance, there is a perception in the public, but also in the business sector, of the high level of the corruption in the judiciary. And this is really bad for the perception of the country. Although we adopted, well, all those beautiful international conventions, Merida Convention Against Corruption, the UN Convention, Council of Europe conventions, we have very good laws. We have very good legislation. It's a word about the legislation. It's a first step, but just the first step. You cannot just, put something in a law and expect that it will work out just like that. You have to take all the measures necessary, from the education, from the other measures to eradicate the corruption in the country. Same goes for the trafficking in human beings. So, but there are some lessons learned. We joined the EU. We had some big cases against some high-profile governmental officials back then, when we joined the EU, but there are still some issues that has to be resolved when it comes to the corruption in a society. It has to do, I think, a little bit with the mentality. In the Mediterranean countries, the corruption is which is wrong, of course, but this is the case of the mentality, considered as some sort of social dynamics within the people. When you go to the medical doctor, it's normally that you bring some small present for him or for her. The same goes when you go to the to pass the exam. And as a professor, I had a lot of problems to convince my students that I'm not supposed to take anything. I have the open door policy, for instance, at my exams, because I'm paid by the government to do what I do. So I'm not supposed to take anything from my students. But this is the problem of the mentality, and that's maybe the problem of the system, because we lived for 45 years in the former Yugoslavia. There was a socialist country, where there was this so to say approach. If you can't get really some service because there were long waiting lists in hospitals, for instance, then you have to bribe someone to get on the list. So it's still, we have a lot, because although now we are for 30 years the country which has, well, multi-party system, it's the capitalist country and so on and so forth, but we have some inherited, so to say, mentality from the previous regime, and I think that we are still paying the price for that. And I think that it will take some time for us to reduce, because as I said, it's not possible to completely get rid of the corruption in a society. It will also exist Even in Denmark and Sweden, there is a certain level on the corruption, and in the Scandinavian countries. But in these countries, corruption is not really a threat to the most fundamental human rights and to the basic values of our society, and that's human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So there are some positive examples I can share with a colleague in private through emails of some good examples and good practices, but we are just on a halfway. We have to do more in fight against corruption here. So there, what I'm trying to say, there are some better countries as a model that could be used as a model for India in reducing the corruption.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Davor. I'm just curious. I'm sorry. I would just like to add one more question here, just as a follow-up question. I think that the assumption generally on our part is that the whole problem of human trafficking requires better laws and better implementation. But especially speaking from the Indian perspective, I mean, it can also be a case where accessing these legal enforcement agencies and legal mechanism in itself is full of all kinds of trauma, and there's all kinds of reasons for people to not actually approach the legal enforcement agencies. So, I mean, when we are involved in thinking about these issues, are we looking in that direction as well? Are we saying that, okay, let's have some kind of informal mechanisms as well that might help us address the trafficking issue in all its forms and shapes, and might be more, accommodative to the victims and to people who are affected by it?
Yes, you are quite right. As I said, well, having legislation is just the first step. And if you don't have really the effective implementation and all the measures that I put in place in order to implement this legislation, it won't work. And I agree with you. I think that we need some informal mechanisms in between the victim and in between the government and the governmental authorities, because it is really unrealistic to expect that a victim would come forward and to report the case to the police for various reasons. As I said, the low trust in the police, I don't know, fear of re-victimization, fear of the revenge by the traffickers, and so on and so forth. So it has to be someone else, I think. And that's why it's very important to build the strategic partnerships with the NGOs, to have NGOs, who are active in the field, to have NGOs that are properly funded, either from national budget or from some other international sources. For instance, we came across the countries in which NGOs really are faced with very serious difficulties in accessing the funds to actually finance their activities, or in countries that are where the politics or the policy in general is not very favorable to the NGOs. But it is very, very important, because this is in Europe, it's a positive obligation of a state to establish that kind of the relationship. For instance, in Greta reports, if there is no NGO dealing with the issues, there is the responsibility not of the NGOs, because the NGOs are not those who are responsible in the implementation of the policies. It's the government, it's the state. But then it's the failure of the state to encourage the atmosphere, the ambience, so to say, to get these NGOs to encourage people to try to express themselves through the NGOs, because there are so many people, I know that for sure, in India, as you said, and as the other colleague said, well, we know there are problems. It's a problem of poverty, it's the problem of exploitation, there are many problems worldwide, and I understand, especially in India, 1.5 billion of the world's population. But India is also one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's a country with the resources, not only financial resources, it's a country with enormous human resources. And I think that it should be put together through the NGO sector and through the governmental sector as well, because neither of these two sectors can actually do anything just by working in isolation. And I think that it would be I would say, good filter in a way in between the victim who's been traumatized and the governmental authorities. And then on the side of the government, as I said, you have to have trained, well-sensitized people. For instance, I spoke to the judges in some countries. There were cases on labor exploitation. And I asked them, so what's the reason that you're acquitting of all the charges? It was in Malta, I remember, and in Georgia, that you're acquitting of all charges those people who were involved in human trafficking on a construction site. They said, you know, because I believe that these persons are not really the victims of human trafficking, because for them, it's still better here than in a country of origin, you know, being, I don't know, Africa or African or some other country. So this is a misperception in a way. And you can have excellent NGOs, you can have very dedicated law enforcement. If you don't have dedicated prosecutor, from the prosecutor point of view, for instance, it's much easier to prove the case of pimping, for instance, or you know, inciting person or organizing a prostitution, than to prove the case of human trafficking, because it's a very complex crime, including all this, because you have to prove all these elements. For their statistics, which is very important for their career advancement. For instance, in my country, it's much easier to prosecute and to legally qualify an act as the organizing prostitution and not as a trafficking. For the judge, well, some of them put the blame on the victim, especially in the cases of the prostitution. They would say this is the case of the shared responsibility. The victim himself or herself is also responsible for what happened, because he, by her or his free will, decided to engage into prostitution. But then the concept of the free will and all the circumstances that surround the victimization of a given person should be taken into due account. And that's why we need all of those who are knowledgeable, who have good intentions, and who are well paid to do that, actually to get together and to try to make a better world, better society, where, well, the human trafficking will be reduced to a minimal level, especially for the most vulnerable, children, minorities, women, and so on.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I wish we had more time to continue, and there's so many thoughts that we could follow upon. But thank you so much, Professor Davor, for addressing the audience and answering the questions in such an insightful manner. Now, I would like to invite one of our students, Janvi Pandey, to deliver the vote of thanks. Janvi, over to you. Janvi, you have to unmute.
Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Janvi Pandey from semester 4, and I am happy to be here to deliver the vote of thanks on the behalf of the students of Institute of Law, Nirma University. Certainly, this session on human trafficking has been thought-provoking for all of us and has deeply sensitized us as against the human suffering. We are sincerely grateful to the speakers, Dr. Davor Derencinovic and Shri Amod Kanth, for accepting our invitation and sharing their valuable time and insightful thoughts with us, even in times as unprecedented as these. We are truly grateful to our beloved Dean and Director, Dr. Professor Purvi Pokhriyal, for providing us with such an opportunity and platform to learn from scholars from across the world by organizing the International Teaching Month. Further, we thank Kushal sir for facilitating this session effortlessly. Essentially, we are deeply thankful to our audience for their patience and kind interaction, which has made this session truly complete and engaging. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. And we look forward to have a greater academic association.
And I'm really grateful for you. Thank you very much for a kind invitation. It was really a pleasure to have this kind of the exchange. I'm grateful to you, to Dr. Nandwani, to other colleagues from Nirma, to Steve Barnes, of course, and to the students. Thank you very much for these kind words, and looking forward to our exchanges in the future, by all means. Well, this is at least there are many of disadvantages of the situation, you know, caused by the COVID. We cannot travel. We stayed, you know. I'm doing everything, you know, from my armchair. The good thing is I'm trying to be transparent. You see, I have a coffee, and this is Indian coffee, by the way. I didn't have any dilemma which kind of coffee to take for this morning. Otherwise, I would put it in a non-transparent cup and drink a scotch. But this time, I decided for the coffee, and it is really a good thing, because there is a possibility to be, you know, on a different places in a very short period of time, and it reduces the expenses. But what is really what you cannot really compensate is the direct interaction in between the people in the classroom. I would never become a professor if I knew at the time that it will look like this, you know, only through the online platforms. but I really do believe that in the near future, we will be free of COVID, and then the borders will open, and then we will be able to interact and have an exchange in person. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much.
Professor
Thank
Davor.
you,
And
Steve.
also,
Thank you, Hayek, for joining us. Thank you so
it
much.
was a very odd time for us, but you've been with us throughout. So thanks a lot, Professor Stephen Barnes. And Professor Davor, thank you. And we all will vouch for that Indian coffee. I can promise you that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.